Hi, I'm Josh, and today I'm going to talk about a book called The Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher. Yes, this is Jim Butcher of the Dresden Files fame, but this is not a Dresden Files book. I did some deep research before starting this video, and Wikipedia informs me that this is the first of a projected 9-book series called the Cinder Spires. I did not realize that there were supposed to be 9 books in the series. Apparently he's signed 3 of the books, so we're going to get at least 3 books in the series. And supposedly there will be 6 more after that if all things go well. Now, I've never read any of the Dresden Files books, so you may be wondering, why would I choose The Aeronaut's Windlass as the first Jim Butcher book that I read when the Dresden Files is such a popular series? What I've heard about the Dresden Files is that it doesn't get off to a great start in the first couple of books, but as you get into the series, it gets quite good. That's just hearsay from what other booktubers have said about the series. But the reason I went for the Aeronaut's Windlass specifically is because I found out it's a steampunk book. And I love the concept of a steampunk setting, but just have not read very much good fiction in that kind of genre. So I thought, well, a steampunk book by Jim Butcher, a known author. Let's give it a shot and see how it goes. So let me tell you about it. Just so you know, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. I am going to talk very little about the plot, and I am definitely not going to spoil anything. So The Aeronaut's Windlass is essentially about a group of people who find themselves in the midst of a military conflict. It's really hard to get into the plot without spoiling anything, because essentially the last 600 pages of this 750 page book are kind of one long extended action slash battle scene that plays out over the course of just a couple of days as far as I can tell. But then the first 150 pages, before we get into all of that, the things that are happening have really almost nothing to do with what happens in the rest of the book. It seems to be some kind of weird events that are happening as a way to introduce the reader to the characters and the setting and the world and all of that stuff. But what actually happens is a little bit disconnected from that final 600-page action scene. And in fact, I considered reading the little summary on the back, but even the summary is a little bit spoilery, and then the very last couple of sentences actually make no sense to me at all, because there was nothing in the book about this. Let me just read those last couple sentences. It says in this book summary, it says, "Humanity's ancient enemy, silent for more than 10,000 years, has begun to stir once more, and death will follow in its wake, ... I don't know anything about humanity's ancient enemy after completing this 750-page novel. No idea what that is referencing, but maybe it's something that's coming up further in the series. I just thought it was weird to, when I got to the end of the book, to then flip over and read the synopsis and discover stuff that I had no idea was part of the story. But anyways, like I said, it is definitely a very plot and action-based book. It follows a handful of very interesting characters as they deal with the fast and furious action that's going on around them. And so there are quite a few point of view characters in the book. There are at least 6 that I could count off the top of my head. It's possible there are 7. But there are definitely 6 point of view characters, so we're following the action through several different eyes. And so I guess the book is a mix of interesting characters with very fast-paced action. Now, because the action plays out, like I said, in a very condensed period of time, we don't get necessarily a lot of character growth or anything like that happening, because even though it's a long enough book, we are following a lot of characters in a short period of time. And it could be argued even that there's not really a main character. There is one who I would sort of pick out above the others as being probably the main character, and then in fact when I read the synopsis on the back they did talk about that character specifically, so I assume that this particular Captain Grimm is supposed to be the main character of the book. But like I said, we are following several different characters' points of view, and we could even argue that there are 6 main characters in the book that we follow. So this Captain Grimm, who is kind of a central figure in everything that's happening here, and he's a very level-headed, stout-hearted, strong leader. Here's one thing we learn early on from Captain Grimm. It was funny, Grimm mused, how often in life a bit of judicious silence could come in handy. So we get a nice little bit of word of wisdom from Captain Grimm early on about the judicious use of silence. I just used a bit of silence there. I'm not sure how judicious it was. Judicious. But anyways, alongside Grimm, we have a crew on this airship that he captains. So his ship and the crew on this ship are an important part of the conflicts that occur here. We have one rather saucy engineer who I kind of appreciated very early on in the book again. We have the second in command on the airship giving orders to the engineer by name of Mr. Journeyman, and the second in command says, "Full power to the shroud, if you please, Mr. Journeyman." "Full power to the shroud, aye, and tell the captain to blow the hell out of them before they can touch our shroud. That storm's too close. He times the approach wrong and we'll be naked." "Maintain discipline, Mr. Journeyman," Creedy said severely. "Maintenance is what I do, idiot," snapped the engineer. "Don't tell me my business, you jumped-up wallipog." Reminds me of one or 2 interactions I have had with supervisors in the past when I was working as a paramedic. But he's another stout fellow who proves to be an important member of the crew there. We also follow some younger, sort of late teenage ladies who are just getting into the military. And these are ladies who come from more of kind of a noble upper crust background, one more than the other. This lady Bridget is a very high class. I liked this one conversation that she was having with somebody named Esterbrook. Bridget says to him, "I'm not sure everyone would agree with you. We're a civilized society, are we not?" Esterbrook blinked. "Since when, miss? We're a democracy." "Just what I mean. We have dispensed with violence as a means of governing ourselves, have we not?" "The heart of democracy is violence, Miss Tagwin," Esterbrook said. Another very valid point there, I would say. And then later in the book, Bridget finds herself in a spot of trouble, and she does this thing that I always find somewhat amusing when they do in books. In fact, I think I talked about it in the last Stephen King book I read, where Bridget is sitting there, having been captured, she's all tied up, and she's thinking to herself, if only she weren't bound, things might be less hopeless. Very well then. What could she do to become unbound? What did the heroines in dramas and books do in such circumstances? So it's just always something I find a little amusing when authors take that, well, what would they do in books kind of look at things. Moving on from some of the prim and proper characters here to some very eccentric folks. We have this one fellow who is known as an etherealist. He's, I would say, the steampunk version of a magician, I suppose. He has certain powers that come with a significant cost to his sanity, and alongside him, and this guy's name is Ferus, and alongside Ferus, the etherist, is an apprentice, a young lady named Folly. I quite appreciate Ferus's slightly off-kilter style of conversation. At one point, he's talking to Captain Grimm, and Ferus beamed. Such a sweet child, and she always remembers perfectly. Now then, Captain, he turned back to Grimm, you have questions, I answers. Shall we see if they match? And then the conversation goes on from there. Despite his eccentricity, though, he does drop the occasional pearl of wisdom, as we see when he's talking about books and authors in particular. And this time Bridget's talking to Ferus. Bridget cleared her throat and said tentatively, "Excuse me, Master Ferus." The etherealist and his apprentice turned their eyes to her. "Yes?" he asked. "I do not mean to intrude, but what are you talking about?" "Books, my dear," Ferus replied. "Books?" Bridget blinked once. "Books do not have souls, sir." "Those who write them do," Ferus said. "They leave bits and pieces behind them when they lay down the words, some scraps and smears of their essential nature." He sniffed. "Most untidy, really, but assemble enough scraps and one might have something approaching a whole." "You believe that the library has a soul?" Bridget asked carefully. "I do not believe it, young lady," Ferus said rather stiffly. "I know it." "I see," Bridget said. "Thank you for answering my question." "You are welcome." Of course, an author is going to say that authors leave a bit of their soul in each book that they write. Seems like a very author-y thing to say, but I do appreciate it as an avid book reader. Before I go on, I just want to take a really quick break to send a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna and Paul. I appreciate it so much. The fact that there are people out there that are rooting for me and that are putting money down to support me and see me succeed is a big deal to me. So I really want to thank all of you. Now, Folly, too, despite her name and her own wild eccentricities, also has some wisdom to drop in at least one case here. They're talking about paying for something, and we have Bridget and Folly interacting with each other here. And Folly says, "Money is a madness, a delusion illusion. It's not made of metal, really. It's made of time. How much is one's time worth? If one can convince enough people that one's time is an invaluable resource, then one has lots and lots of money. That's why one can spend time, only one can never get a refund." So these are a few examples of some of the interesting characters that we get to follow along the way. But the one that really made me sit up and pay attention was one of the characters actually owns a cat, and this cat sticks pretty close by to the character most of the time. And early on in the book, I start reading a chapter, and all of a sudden I realize, oh, I'm reading from the cat's point of view now. And in fact, the owner of the cat, or vice versa, the cat's human, more accurately stated, can speak the cat language and can converse with the cat, as can one or two of the other characters in the book. So all of a sudden I find myself with a talking cat who becomes one of the point of view characters in the book, which was quite amusing and fun. I even like how the movements of this cat, whose name is Rowl, are described. Bridget is talking to the cat Rowl this time, and she says, "Oh, you're impossible," Bridget said. "Yes, cat." Rowl rose and flowed down onto the floor. But isn't that exactly how cats move? He flowed down onto the floor. So yeah, once I was getting into the book, discovering the steampunk world, and then found that we were seeing it partly through the eyes of a cat, I was like, okay, I'm in for a fun ride here. This should be pretty good. And for the most part, that was the case. That one 600-page action scene did go on a bit long. And there were a couple of instances here where Jim Butcher, I felt, struggled a bit with his similes. Here are a couple of examples to show you what I mean. Bridget turned to Rowl and held out her arms. The ginger cat padded over and leapt into them, nuzzled his cheek against hers again, and settled down comfortably. His softness was a favorite blanket, and his purr was as familiar as one of her mother's barely remembered lullabies. How familiar can it be if it's barely remembered? It's weird to say as familiar as one of her mother's barely remembered lullabies. But here's another rather odd example much later in the book. Now we're talking about an air battle between airships taking place, and it says, "And still, blast after blast howled down from Mist Shark's cannon, shattering more of the shipyard's decking like an angry man with a hammer, destroying fine tableware, and claiming airship after airship with methodical precision, unleashing the full destructive power of an armed vessel upon the defenseless shipyard." So they were shattering the ship's decking like an angry man with a hammer destroying fine tableware. All right. This seems like an odd simile, but anyways, there is one thing that kind of irritated me about the story. I can't go into detail for the sake of spoilers, but I will say that essentially the same thing happens to the same group of characters twice in very short succession, which made me go, we just went through this. This just happened. How is it now happening a second time? It was a little puzzling and made me think the author could have come up with something a little bit different, at least, you would think. But that aside, one thing I appreciated a lot about the book at the ending, and again, I'm not spoiling anything, but it's interesting how these young new soldiers, after having been through combat, having experienced death and even killed people, how they are then dealing with their feelings after the fact. And I feel like a lot of these fantasy books don't necessarily go into the impact that this death and violence would have on a person. And again, as somebody who has PTSD as a result of 16 years of paramedic work, is something that I really appreciated them exploring towards the end of the book. And there's a cool conversation that I'll read a snippet of here between one of the young ladies named Gwen and Captain Grimm. So Gwen approaches Captain Grimm, this grizzled, experienced combat veteran, and she has come through all the action and safely on the other side, and they're kind of heading back home. And she's just wondering, how am I supposed to return to normal life after having killed and seeing people die and experienced all this violence? So here are some snippets of that particular conversation. So Gwen is speaking to start off with. She says, And I was here for the battle. I saw..." Gwen found her throat closing off. She forced herself to speak more clearly. "It was terrible. When I close my eyes, I'm not quite sure I need to be asleep to have nightmares anymore, Captain." "Aye," Grimm said. He returned to the table, poured some of the liquor into each glass, and passed one to her before he sat. Gwen stared down at the glass without really seeing it. "It's just that I was among these things. I saw these things, and now..." "Now you're on the way back to be among people who didn't," Grimm said quietly. Gwen blinked and felt her eyes widen slightly as she looked up at him. Yes, that's it exactly. I had no idea what the world could be like until I saw it, felt it." She shook her head, unable to continue. "How are you going to talk to someone who has no idea?" Grimm said, nodding. "How can you explain something you can't find words for? How can you get someone else to understand something for which they have no frame of reference?" "Yes," Gwen said. Her throat tightened up again. "Yes, that's it exactly." That just felt so familiar with myself and my paramedic work and the things I've experienced. How can you get someone else to understand something for which they have no frame of reference? How can you explain something you don't have words for? That's all so deeply familiar to me, and I appreciated that they threw that in at the end of the book, in that it wasn't all just, hooray, we are victorious, everything is good for now, and off we go back to our normal lives. But there are real consequences for the things that happened in the book, and I like that a lot. Now, will I read 8 more books like this? I don't know. I could see myself reading the next book that comes out and taking it from there. Like I said, this one already felt a little long considering what was happening in the book in the short time period it covered. But on the whole, it was fairly enjoyable. Here's one thing, again, related to my PTSD. I got to wondering, I've been experiencing, over the past year in particular, I've been experiencing such deep depression, and it's affected my ability to enjoy things that I might have found enjoyment in before. And so And it's something that I didn't bring up because it didn't occur to me when I was talking about art and artists and reviewing art in that other video I did. And that is, how can somebody who is very deeply depressed review art when their ability to find joy in things is so deeply affected? It's hardly fair to whatever it is I'm talking about, whether it's a book or a game or whatever. But I can say that I did get a good amount of enjoyment out of this book. It was a fun book. It was light. Like I said, there were some pearls of wisdom here and there, and some nice reflection at the end of the book. So it wasn't all just fluff, which I appreciated as well. On the whole, it was a decent steampunk novel, which is what I had hoped to find. Have you read any steampunk books that are any good? I'd really love to hear about it. And I'd also love to hear about what you're reading now in general. I always love to talk about books, of course. Hey, it's Josh. You know why I'm here. Sometimes you just need that friendly reminder to give a little thumb up, to subscribe to the channel, to share the video with somebody who would enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. And these are lady who... So Gwen is